Hello, you're listening to Astrology Hotline. I'm Kyle Pierce, and this was the forecast for January 9th, 2023 through January 15th. The first time I recorded it, but due to a microphone malfunction, I was unable to, I didn't end up actually getting the audio for the original forecast. So being that it is Monday night already, and going through the day by day is going to be of increasingly limited value. I'm just going to focus on the main event for this week, astrologically, and that is Mars stationing direct. And this is kind of too important, too significant of a transit not to say something about, as much as I'm not exactly eager to retread the same territory again. Suppose we all have to pay our dues to our retrograde Lord of Communication, Mercury, which, as I'm recording just now, is still retrograde and still very much combust, or at least pretty burnt, though starting to separate from its conjunction with the sun back on Saturday the 7th, which I hope you all received some useful clarification or insight during the Mercury Cazimi. I certainly did, but it would seem that those insights don't negate the retrograde condition of Mercury still. Still got a ways to go, which I would say is going to be still relevant to Mars stationing direct on about January 12th, Thursday morning, because even when Mars is starting to move forward, its ruler, Mercury, is still going backwards. So certainly expect to see a change in direction or a shift in momentum on the day of the station, but don't expect to quite have full traction yet until Mercury also stations direct next Wednesday, January 18th. But perhaps we should get ourselves reacquainted real quick with the sort of sequence of events around Mars's retrograde in Gemini, which we would typically identify as beginning when Mars reaches, it's called its shadow degree, which is basically when Mars, in this case, reached the degree on which it's stationing on Thursday, as it marks the span of degrees that Mars is going to end up covering, not once like it usually does, but 3 times. And it will spend an especially long time on this particular degree, as even as it's stationing to start moving forward, it takes some time to get that train moving again. But it's also certainly worth noting when Mars initially entered Gemini. So in the broadest sense, Mars's retrograde in Gemini means just a lot of Mars in Gemini. And its entrance into the sign is going to be a relevant point to mark events that are tied to this cycle, both personally and in a mundane sense. So Mars initially entered Gemini on August 20th, 2022, and then entered the shadow period on September 4th, 2022. And then over the next month or so, continued to decelerate until stationing retrograde on Halloween night, or on Halloween, October 31st of 2022 at 25 degrees of Gemini. And since then, Mars has been grinding down on the degrees of Gemini between 25 and 8 degrees, right up until Thursday, January 12th, where Mars will retread that middle portion of Gemini one last time, finally leaving its shadow March 16th of 2023, and finally, mercifully, leaving Gemini March 26th. So you may want to reflect back on significant events that have happened so far around those significant dates, particularly if you have planets in Gemini, especially between 8 and 25 degrees of Gemini, but also if you have planets in mutable signs between those degrees. But also, just in case you thought you were safe, Cancers and Capricorns, due to the relationship that the sign of Gemini has with Cancer and Capricorn called Anticia and Contra and Tisha, respectively. The retrograde is also likely to be impactful for you if you have planets or important angles on, and to a lesser degree in between, 5 degrees of Cancer, 5 and 22 degrees of Cancer and Capricorn. So what can we expect from Mars stationing retrograde? From Mars stationing direct? What does it mean? Well, there are a few ways I like to think about it. One way is that you can imagine being Mars, and because you are Mars, you like to drive around in a big ass tank. And as you are Mars, terrorizing the world with your big ass tank, moseying through Gemini, say you stop at the local diner because, terrorizing people is hungry business. And, you leave the diner, you get back on the freeway, and you get all the way to 25 degrees of Gemini. You realize you forgot your favorite grenade launcher back at the diner. And again, because you are Mars and you believe that traffic laws are for suckers, you don't get off at the nearest exit, but you just put your tank in reverse and start grinding backwards against traffic, just smashing any cars that don't manage to swerve out of the way until you finally get back to the diner. And the whole time you are super pissed that you had to waste all this time because you're Mars. You like to go forward and you like to go in straight lines. And so now that you're back at 8 degrees of Gemini, you stomp in the diner, you grab your grenade launcher, flick off the waitress and kick the busboy in the balls and stomp back into your tank. And you get back on the freeway, except now there is a freeway full of wreckage because some asshole plowed through oncoming traffic in reverse for about a 18-degree stretch of road. And, there may even be a traffic jam, because the road is so obstructed. So as Mars, you might have to take another route, or you might just have to wait patiently through the traffic jam, which you're not likely to do. But driving over the top of the traffic jam, monster truck style, is also going to, take some additional time. We're not moving forward full speed ahead, and we're probably still rather pissed that we are essentially retracing ground that we already covered, but perhaps with the relief that, we didn't forget anything this time. And, hopefully the vast majority of us are at least trying to exercise some of the more courageous and noble virtues of Mars, and, or maybe living a less destructive version of this. Certainly, you're likely to suffer fewer impediments going forward if you've been exercising a bit of self-restraint the past couple months. But also, other faculties of your psyche, which do not fall under the domain of Mars, are also at play. So, for the vast majority of us, less dramatic and less destructive versions of this are likely to be what you've encountered so far. But nonetheless, this is the sort of energy that we've been dealing with. And probably in more of an essential quality of this period is there is sort of a buildup of martial energy happening. This is like if you're playing Sonic the Hedgehog and you're, really cruising, but at some point you hit one of the little spiky pits and you bounce off, you lose all your rings. You're still alive, but, you lost your momentum. You're low on lives. You got a boss battle coming up. And, one of those big helix spirals that you got to get through to get to the next stage. And for that, you need speed. So you got to back up a little bit, rebuild your speed, now knowing where all the jumps and obstacles are so that you can make it through that helix loop. So what this point is in the Mars cycle is a point where some of the energy or tension that has been built up is going to start to release or start to be directed in a more specific direction. Mars can finally return to its mission now that it's removed, now that it's gotten whatever it came back for at this point. Now, that's going to be the general energy of any Mars retrograde cycle, and it applies here as much as it does to any other Mars retrograde. But we want to look more specifically what's happening in relationship with Mars as he gets back on the warpath. What kind of influences is he under? Is he being antagonized by anything in particular? Is he being supported in any particular way? Is he being pacified, maybe, or stabilized? I don't know. Let's take a look. Well, what's rather interesting about this Mars station is Mars is stopping and is going to be essentially sitting on this degree for the rest of the month, and it is in a conjunction with the fixed star Aldebaran. This is one of the royal fixed stars. It's a very powerful star. And all four of the royal fixed stars have a certain way of going about achieving power. And Aldebaran goes about achieving power by means of the acquisition of stuff, essentially, of material things like wealth, money, property, land. But this acquisition can also apply to things like ideas, friends, or allies. The idea is having control over something over which there is some maybe finite amount available, or sort of acquiring a favorable distribution of a set portion of something in order to have an advantage or like dominant share of something. So it's kind of during the stationary period, we might start to see Mars starting to accumulate resources in order to launch or support its mission, right? Whatever its goal is. Now, Mars also has a bit of support from planetary influences as well during this period of its station, as we have Venus separating from a trine with Mars, about 12 degrees of Aquarius, and Jupiter applying to a sextile that won't quite perfect, but at this point it's within orb, we'll say, of a wide sextile. But this actually can represent a form of benefic enclosure for Mars, as Mars is basically sitting in between the rays of benefic planets, Jupiter and Venus, without the intervention of another aspect. And while it'll get broken up sporadically by the moon, Mars is essentially going to stay like that for at least the first couple weeks. Now that enclosure is going to get wider and weaker as Venus continues moving forward in Aquarius and eventually making a conjunction with Saturn. However, this does rather look like Mars is supported to one degree or another, maybe in some cases being made good. Though, with Mars, Mars can't be favorable to everybody. In the games that Mars plays, there is always a winner and a loser. So while favorable for some folks, some entities, still likely to be disfavorable for others, really depending on which side of Mars you land on. But, we might see generally, at least hopefully, maybe a more humane or careful application of Mars force, at least more than usual would be ideal. Or perhaps this could kind of look like Venus and Jupiter containing Mars and only allowing it to rain destruction down on its specific sort of area of action, where it needs to. I can't remember off the top of my head which general said this, which historical general said this, but the quote goes something like, the only good war is a swift war, or something to that effect. Essentially, the idea being that the faster a conflict ends, the less overall destruction there is. And that is kind of the thing with Mars retrograde, is that it's not fast moving Mars. It's very slow. So in many ways, it can maximize destruction or draw that destruction out over a long, agonizing period of time. So, while Mars may not be moving fast yet, hopefully this can at least look like more of a surgical kind of strike, where we're only cutting where necessary in whichever area of your life this might apply, or perhaps getting the opportunity to evacuate and save some of your possessions before the house burns down, so to speak. But there is one other factor that could potentially fly under the radar. There's maybe not immediately obvious, and that is that once again, Antisha seemed to be at play once again. As if you count from the cusp of Cancer to where Mars is, you get 22 degrees. Likewise, if you count from the cusp of where Capricorn is to where this, from the cusp of Capricorn to where the sun is, you get, 22 degrees. So this would be a contra Antisha, which some astrologers have likened to being of the nature of an opposition, as they represent points in the zodiac where the length of day and night mirror each other, but they're opposite. So while the day might be, say, hypothetically 16 hours long at 8 degrees Gemini, and the night 8 hours, inversely, the night would be 16 hours long and the day 8 hours over at 22 Capricorn. So they're not doing the same thing like they would be at, say, 8 degrees of Gemini and 22 Cancer, which would have the same length of day and night. They're doing a sort of opposite sort of thing. And so Mars is doing a sort of opposite sort of thing to the sun. And while the relationship between Mars and the sun is potentially more contentious in nature to varying degrees, there's an interesting sort of theme around both planets that sort of looks similar, and that is with Mars on Aldebaran, looking to acquire and amass material and sort of win by conquest. If you're playing like Civ 5 or something, where you get different kinds of victories. You get cultural victories, political victories, science victories. This is a conquest victory that Mars is looking for, which naturally is suits Mars. The sun at 22 Capricorn is in the third decan of Capricorn, which is in the Chaldean order, a solar decan. It's a sun-ruled decan. So there's sort of a throne here for the sun to sit on. And the kind of throne it is a very earthly material sort of throne. The themes that come up in this decan have to do with how one goes about acquiring and maintaining control over a physical domain, and how to secure and stabilize its resources so that it doesn't crumble from within or succumb to forces from without. Naturally, in Capricorn, you're going to tend to want to build a wall around that particular domain, right? It doesn't quite have the same invasion kind of energy that maybe Mars Aldebaran does, but certainly both seem to have something to say about asserting dominance and control over a geographical location, potentially. And, Mars and the sun are not completely dissimilar planets. They are certainly different, but they're both hot in terms of temperament. They're both hot and dry. So they're both active and kind of separating, individuating planets. And, when you just look at their glyphs, though, you can see that like Mars has a pointy thing at the end. It's like a circle with a spear. So it is directed and penetrating, while the sun is sort of expanding and occupying. So you often get Mars being much like a soldier, with the sun being a bit more like a king. And, when it comes to the sort of little enclosure that Mars is experiencing, I mean, you could say that this relationship with the sun might be breaking that enclosure to some degree, but it has me thinking that it's kind of isolating the direction of Mars's focus in the direction of the sun. And traditionally, when it came to these anticial relationships, the signs were sort of given different roles in those relationships. In this case, Gemini was said to be a commanding sign, while Capricorn is a obeying sign. Basically, all the signs from Aries to Virgo are considered commanding, while the signs from Libra to Pisces were obeying signs. Say that like Gemini speaks and Capricorn listens. It's also been put as like Gemini seeing Capricorn while Capricorn beholds Mars. Maybe seems like a subtle distinction, but it's the idea that in this context, in theory, Mars would be doing something to the sun a little more than the sun is doing something to Mars. The sun is maybe receiving something from Mars. And, in a lot of contexts, there could be a bit of a mitigation to what could be a contentious relationship between Mars and the sun, depending on how you look at it, given that the sun is in Mars's exaltation, sign of Mars's exaltation, which may make Mars a little more sympathetic. Could also be seen as Mars having a little more knowledge of the space that the sun is occupying than maybe the sun does. I don't know, a lot of different ways of looking at it. But I'm thinking about the idea of how often a swift end to a conflict is the most merciful or least destructive way to engage in a conflict. One of the ways I can think to end a conflict, at least one between armies, is by taking out the leader. If you take out the leader, the army will tend to disintegrate, and you may be able to win a battle without having to fight at all. Now, I'll leave that to your own imagination to see how that, consider how that might play out on a more personal level, or individual level, or less literal level. But it does have me thinking about the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. Typically during a Mars retrograde cycle, you can look to any literal wars happening in the world at any given time and see those themes playing out. It's around when Mars entered its shadow period is when Ukraine launched the Kherson offensive, which was this kind of tricky, multi-pronged attack on Russian forces that resulted in a rapid advancement of Ukrainian forces and reoccupying of a significant amount of territory. And since then, it's sort of slowed down, sort of devolved into almost like trench-like warfare in certain areas. But around Mars's station retrograde, Vladimir Putin announced a partial mobilization of Russian forces, which essentially amounted to the mass conscription of up to 300,000 Russian citizens. And it's resulted in a big kind of public backlash, a bunch of people fleeing the country, and he ended up rescinding or suspending the mobilization and looked into other means, many of which questionable as to their efficacy, to solve the manpower issue that Russia is having. Now, similarly, Ukraine has a problem with a different kind of shortage, and that's a shortage in ammunition and weapons. Ukraine has all the manpower that it needs for the most part, but has essentially been waiting for Western nations to supply sufficient weapons and ammunition and other material supplies to sustain their war effort. So at this point in the conflict, both sides are sort of limited in their capacity to pursue an aggressive strategy and have been kind of using alternative means in some cases, such as mass drone strikes, right, with Mars and Gemini, or otherwise engaging in these kind of long and very deadly battles where both sides suffer a lot of casualties for a much smaller amount of territory gained. So I would certainly expect to see some significant developments around the Mars station. And I'm very interested to see how some of the specifics of this might play out. I have read some articles suggesting that Ukraine has been amassing forces for an offensive against Russia, which would be it would be a bit of a strange time for an offensive, given that it's the middle of winter in an area of the world known for having some of the harshest winters, or at least winters that are not super conducive to a lot of movement. And furthermore, winters that have been known to destroy an invading force on multiple occasions in history. I've also read that European production is finally starting to catch up to Ukrainian demands. So I'm a little reticent to say specifically what I think might happen, but I think at minimum we can expect to see the nature of the conflict evolve and change and possibly start to pick up speed over the next few weeks. And then I'd hate to be then at the risk of being overly optimistic, as somebody who would like to see a swift end to the conflict, ideally in favor of Ukrainian sovereignty, personally. The theme with the Mars-Sun quadrantia could look like, if not being applied to this conflict specifically, Mars-Sun stuff, we might see somewhere in the world the death, perhaps a sudden or violent one, of a solar figure of some kind, a leader or someone with a significant public profile. This could look also like the overthrow of a status quo government of some kind, or like the hostile takeover of a corporation, potentially. There are a lot of interesting ways that this can play out, but I think individually, it does represent a moment to sort of stop and listen to what Mars has to say. Mars is going to be in a condition known as a phasis, and a phasis is basically a one of several conditions that a planet can be in where it is likely to make a statement, sort of announce itself and its intentions. Stations are one of these moments, as well as sign ingresses and helical risings as well. That is when a planet first becomes visible in the sky, either by rising or emerging from being obfuscated by the rays of the sun when in a conjunction. So I know I have set an intention to go out Wednesday or Thursday night, ideally during the hour of Mars, and see what Mars has to say. Often when you set an intention like that to greet a planet during one of these moments of phasis, you'll get some weird and usually very meaningful co-occurrences. Pay attention to any objects that are out of the ordinary, or any animals that you might encounter when you do that, and can often pull a lot of meaning out of those little encounters. And in fact, if you end up doing something like this during Mars' station and you have any interesting encounters, I would really, really love to hear what your experience is. These stories are usually very interesting, and I'd be glad to help you pull apart, maybe the meaning of what you see or experience, help you figure it out. But with that, I'm going to forego the day by day this week and call it a night. And don't forget to leave us a review if you're listening on Spotify, Apple, or iTunes. It's super easy and really helps the podcast out, especially in getting the podcast associated with like other podcasts that you listen to in the algorithms, and increasing the chance that Astrology Hotline will appear as a recommendation for people who like, the same stuff that you do. And if you're interested in learning about the 36 decans of the Zodiac, consider joining us on the Three of Wands Discord server for our tri-monthly decan crawl. It's about 3 Tuesdays a month at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, during which we go over the meaning and associated images and associated deities of whichever decan the sun is in for that week, and engage in a group discussion in which we share our thoughts and interpretations and how they might show up in our lives and in the world. And you can find the link to the server in the show notes. We would love to have you join the discussion. And as always, you can book a reading with me at KylePierceAstrologer.com. You all have a great week. Thanks so much for listening. And if you have a question you would like to hear answered on Astrology Hotline, shoot us an email at astrologyhotlinepod@gmail.com.